It was a rainy night, the kind where the rain comes down so hard you can barely see anything in front of you. I had rented an old cabin deep in the Washington woods for the weekend to get away from everything. It seemed like the perfect place. Quiet, far from people, exactly what I needed to clear my head. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove, a squeaky bed, and a kitchen that hadn't been touched in years. The windows were old too, with the glass slightly bent. The rain hit them hard, almost like it was trying to break in. There was no phone signal, which I knew would happen, and I didn't mind. I had a couple of books, some food, and plenty of firewood to get me through the weekend. The sound of the rain should have been calming, but something about the cabin made me feel uneasy. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the loneliness, the dark, and being in a place I wasn't used to. I lit a fire in the wood stove, hoping the warmth and the soft crackling would make me feel better. But as the night went on, the bad feeling grew stronger. Every now and then, I'd hear a strange thump or creak, but I kept telling myself it was just the old wood shifting because of the storm. The rain kept coming down hard, slamming against the roof like a drum that wouldn't stop. Around midnight, the power went out. I didn't think too much about it. It was an old cabin, and storms like this often knocked out electricity. I lit a couple of candles and sat by the fire, trying to stay calm. But then I started to notice something weird. The rain was loud, but there was another sound mixed in with it. Something steady, almost like a pattern. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was a tapping sound, quiet but constant, coming from the front door. I froze, staring at the door. The tapping didn't stop. My heart was pounding as I stood up slowly. Maybe it was a branch, I thought, trying to calm myself down. But branches don't knock. I grabbed the fire poker, the closest thing I had to a weapon, and carefully stepped toward the door. The tapping stopped as I got closer. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the door. Part of me wanted to open it to see what was out there, but I couldn't make myself do it. Something felt wrong, really wrong. I backed away slowly and sat back down by the fire, trying to act like nothing was happening. As I sat down, I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly toward the window to my right. In the dim light from the fire, I could see the shape of someone standing just outside the window, not moving. They were close, so close that if the window wasn't there, they could have reached out and touched me. I didn't move, couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Whoever or whatever was out there just stood still, staring straight at me. Slowly, I reached down for my flashlight, keeping my eyes on the figure. I turned on the light and pointed it at the window. But when the beam hit the glass, the figure was gone. Nothing but the rain was there. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a shadow from the storm. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was really wrong. The rest of the night felt like it went on forever. Every little sound made me jump. I didn't dare close my eyes. The tapping came back a few times, always faint, always at the door, but I stayed where I was. The rain kept falling, making it hard to hear anything clearly. I stayed by the fire, gripping the fire poker, waiting for the night to end. Finally, the rain slowed down as the first light of morning came through the clouds. I didn't waste any time packing up my stuff. I'd had enough of that cabin and the woods. As I walked to my car, something caught my eye on the porch, right near the door where I'd heard the tapping all night. In the mud, I saw a set of wet footprints, much too big to be mine. I felt a shiver go through me as I opened the car door. But then I stopped. I stared at the muddy footprints again, realizing they weren't leading away from the cabin. They were leading inside. I got into my car and drove away as fast as I could. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there last night hadn't left. I always wanted to see the deep forests of South America, far from people. I found a small cabin deep in the jungle that I could rent for a few nights. The owner warned me it was far from everything, and once I got there, I'd be truly alone. That sounded perfect to me, no distractions, just me and nature. Getting there wasn't easy. The road got worse as the trees got thicker, growing tall and blocking out most of the sunlight. When I finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than I thought. The place looked old, like it had been beaten by years of rain and heat. The air felt heavy and damp, and the sounds of the forest were nonstop. Buzzing bugs, rustling leaves, and a few birds here and there. The first day was calm. I walked around the cabin, looking at all the plants and trees. Felt good to be so far from everything. But as it got dark, the feeling changed. The night in the forest was like nothing I had ever seen before. The trees were so thick that no moonlight got through, and without electricity, the only light I had was a small lantern. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder, like everything that hid during the day had come out. By the second night, something felt wrong. I didn't know why, but it felt like I wasn't really alone anymore. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just spooking myself. But as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard something. At first, it was hard to pick out from the usual jungle noise. A faint rustling, then the clear sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps right outside the cabin. I froze. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin, slowly, like someone was walking around it, staying just out of sight. It went on for hours. I lay there, listening to those footsteps, afraid to move. The lantern flickered weakly, casting shadows on the thin cabin walls that felt like they could be torn open at any moment. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, but I couldn't relax. I didn't sleep that night, waiting for the sound to start again. When morning came, everything seemed normal. The forest was alive again with birds and insects, like the night before had never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. I decided then that I couldn't stay another night. The peace I had come here for now felt like a trap. As I packed up, I noticed something outside the cabin that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Bare human footprints circled the cabin, not just once, but over and over, like someone had been watching me for hours. Worse, they weren't fresh. They'd been there for days. I hadn't noticed them before. I didn't waste any more time. I left as fast as I could, not even stopping to eat. The whole walk back through the jungle, I felt like I was being followed. Every sound, every snapping twig, made me jump. I kept turning around, sure I'd see someone standing there, but there was never anyone. I finally made it out of the forest, but the feeling hasn't left me. I keep thinking about those footprints, circling the cabin before I even arrived. Someone had been there, watching, waiting, and the scariest part is, I'll never know who it was, or why they never came closer. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and steady, circling, just out of sight. I was really excited for the weekend at the cabin with my friend from the workshop. We had both been working so much lately, and a weekend away sounded like just what we needed. The cabin was far out in the woods, away from any houses or roads, and the only things we could hear were the wind in the trees and birds. It was quiet. We spent the first day just relaxing. We did a little fishing at the nearby lake, built a fire, and sat around talking about random stuff while we ate. Felt nice to be away from everything for a while. When it got dark, we went to bed early. The air was cool, and the silence of the forest was calming. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't explain why, but I just knew. I stayed really still, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard it. A sound outside, quiet but clear. It wasn't an animal. The noise was too controlled, like someone moving slowly around the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I kept listening, my heart starting to race. A couple of minutes passed, and then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy steps, like someone was walking back and forth near the door. My heart was pounding. I looked over at my friend, still asleep, totally unaware of what was happening. I didn't move. I was hoping that whoever was outside would just go away. But then the steps got closer. I could hear them right near the window now. My stomach sank. And then I realized it wasn't just one person. I could hear more footsteps, 2 or 3, maybe more. They were moving around the cabin, like they were checking it out from all sides. I stayed frozen, too scared to even breathe loudly. I kept trying to convince myself it was just hikers or people passing through, but I knew deep down that nobody should be out here. Not at this time of night, this far into the woods. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. My chest felt tight, like my heart was about to burst. I was sure they were going to come in, but after a few long seconds, the sound stopped and the footsteps moved away from the door. I could hear them getting farther away, but I didn't feel safe. Felt like they were still watching, waiting for something. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely moving. My friend slept through the whole thing, but I couldn't close my eyes. I listened for any other sounds, but after the footsteps faded, everything was quiet again. Not the same quiet as before, though. Felt like the silence was hiding something. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to go outside. There were footprints everywhere, around the cabin, near the windows, and right by the door. They had been circling us for who knows how long. I woke up my friend, and we packed up fast. We didn't talk much as we left, just kept looking around, checking the trees and the path back to the car. When we were about halfway home, I finally told him about the footprints. He didn't say anything, but I saw the look in his eyes. He felt the same thing I did. The worst part was that we never saw anyone, never figured out who it was or what they wanted. But they were out there watching us. And somehow I know they're still out there waiting for the next group to come along, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. I hadn't been back to the cabin in years, not since Greg was gone. My brother loved it up there in the woods, far from everything. He'd spend whole weekends out there, cutting wood, fishing, and doing things that made him feel alive. I wasn't really into it, but I'd tag along sometimes, just to spend time with him. One weekend, it was just the two of us. The sky was cloudy, and the air felt cold. We weren't expecting any storms, but something about the air made it feel like one was coming. That was the last time I saw him. We'd been chopping wood near the cabin when Greg said he was going to check something down by the lake. I kept working, figuring he'd be back soon, but he never came back. Hours went by and I started to worry. I searched everywhere, calling his name, looking through the trees, by the water, but there was no sign of him. Nothing. By morning, the police came out and they searched too. But just like me, they didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Months later, they told us he was dead. They said it was probably an accident. Maybe he fell into the lake or got lost in the woods. I never believed that. Greg knew those woods. He wasn't the type to get lost, and he was always careful around the water. But what could I do? He was gone, and I had to try and live with it. Years went by, and I did my best to move on. But sometimes, I'd feel this pull to go back. Like I needed to see the place again, even though I didn't want to. I guess I thought I might find some answers if I went back to the cabin. So one day, I packed up and drove out there. It looked the same as it did the day Greg went missing. Nothing had changed. I walked around the cabin, through the trees just like I used to with Greg. But something didn't feel right. The whole place felt different, like the air was thicker, and the woods were too quiet, like they were watching me. I walked down to the lake, and that's when I saw it. One of the trees near the water had been marked, like someone had cut into it recently. I walked closer, and I saw it clear as day. 2 letters carved into the bark, Gr. Greg's initials, and they were fresh, like someone had just done it. I just stood there, staring at those letters. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't think straight. Greg was gone. I knew that, but these marks were new. There was no way they'd been here before. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was out there, but the woods were still. The water didn't even ripple. It was just me and those initials, carved deep into the tree like someone wanted me to see them. I stayed at the cabin that night, but I didn't get any sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept thinking about those initials, wondering who could have done it. It wasn't an accident. Greg didn't just disappear. Something else happened that day. Something no one talked about. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and left. I didn't tell anyone what I found, and I don't plan on ever going back. Whatever happened to Greg, I know now it wasn't some simple accident. Someone or something is out there, waiting. I think about it sometimes, how those woods feel like they're holding on to a secret, something no one's supposed to find out. I don't know if Greg ever left those woods, not really. And the worst part? I'm starting to feel like whatever took him is waiting for me next. I had been driving for hours, the road going on and on in front of me like it would never end. It was late, and the only light came from my headlights, cutting through the dark. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever, and the quiet, empty road was starting to mess with my head. My eyes felt heavy, but I couldn't stop. Home was still far away. Out of nowhere, I saw a small cabin on the side of the road, barely visible in the shadows. There was a traffic police sign on it, and a weak light flickered above the door. I figured I'd pull over, stretch my legs a bit, maybe rest or check in with the officer. As I got closer, the cabin looked old and beat up, like nobody had been there for a long time. The door was open just a little, moving with the breeze. I stepped out of my car and started walking toward it. The sound of gravel under my shoes was the only noise in the stillness. Inside, the cabin felt colder than it was outside. I looked around. The place was a mess. Papers all over the desk, everything covered in dust. There was an old radio in the corner that was turned off, and a couple of broken chairs pushed off to the side. There was no sign of anyone, not even a car or a bike outside. I felt a bit uneasy but told myself it was nothing. Maybe the officer was just gone for a bit. I was about to leave when something on the desk caught my eye. There were pictures, black and white, blurry photos of cars with different license plates. My eyes locked on one of them. It was my car, my exact car, parked exactly where I was at that very moment. I froze, staring at the picture. My heart started racing. How could this picture have been taken? I had just gotten there. I glanced out the window toward my car. Nothing had changed, but now I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me. I stepped back from the desk, trying to make sense of what was happening. But before I could think straight, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, and coming from behind the cabin. I looked out the window again, but there was no one. I didn't wait around to see who or what was coming. I bolted out of the cabin, jumped into my car, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, and I sped off, not even caring about the speed limit anymore. The tires screeched as I pulled onto the road, the cabin quickly fading in my rearview mirror. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. The road was as empty as before. I didn't stop again until I reached the next town, still shaking, trying to make sense of it all. I wanted to tell someone, but what could I even say? There was no proof, just that one photo I saw, a picture I never should have seen. Even now, I think about that cabin. I wonder if anyone else has stopped there or if I was just unlucky. But what really haunts me is the sound of those footsteps. There was someone or something there, and I didn't stay long enough to find out what. I don't want to know. Whatever it wasn't right. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that moment. I've tried to forget it, but then I remember something. My car was the only one there, but those other pictures on the desk, the ones of different cars, I can't help but wonder, where are those cars now, and what happened to the people driving them? I hadn't been to my grandma's cabin in Norway since I was a kid. I remembered it as a cozy place, hidden deep in the woods, far away from any towns. When I got the chance to go back, I was excited. Life had been stressful lately, and spending a week alone sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. The drive to the cabin was long, but once I turned onto the small dirt road leading into the forest, I started to relax. Being out here where no one would bother me felt peaceful. The cabin looked just like it did all those years ago. Small, a bit worn down, but still standing strong. The first day passed without much happening. I walked through the woods trying to remember the area. The trees were tall and seemed to go on forever. The air was cold, but it felt fresh, not like the city. That night, I started a fire in the old fireplace, sat down with a book, and let the crackling of the fire fill the silence. But by the third day, that silence didn't feel so relaxing anymore. I started noticing things. The trees, for example, seemed closer to the cabin than I remembered. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, it had been years since I'd last been here. The next morning, I woke up to snow falling outside. At first, it looked nice, but as the day went on, it kept falling harder and faster. It became clear that I might get stuck if the snow didn't stop. I wasn't too worried yet. I had enough food for a few days, and it wasn't the first time I'd been snowed in somewhere. That evening, I stepped outside to see how deep the snow had gotten. It was already up to my knees. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the forest, coming right toward the cabin. They were fresh, still clear, and not covered by snow yet. I froze, staring at them. They were human footprints, but I hadn't seen anyone else out here. The prints weren't mine. I hadn't left the cabin all day. I followed the trail with my eyes, watching as they disappeared back into the woods. Whoever made them had come close to the cabin and then walked away, deeper into the forest. I didn't want to know where they led. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and made sure all the windows were shut tight. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. The wind outside was loud, but I kept thinking I heard something else. Too, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I told myself it was just the wind pushing the snow around. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I checked outside. The footprints were still there, but now they circled the cabin. It was like someone had been walking around, watching the place. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was someone lost in the woods, a hiker, but I hadn't seen any other cabins around, and no one should have been out here in this snow. I stayed inside all day, not taking my eyes off the windows. The snow kept falling, and the woods seemed to close in, making me feel more trapped. By the time evening came, the prints were gone, buried under the fresh snow. But knowing they were gone didn't make me feel safer. I made the decision to leave the next morning, before the snow got too deep. I didn't care if the roads were bad. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag, making sure I had everything ready to go as soon as the sun came up. Then, as I was getting my stuff together, I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, heavy footsteps, crunching through the snow. They came closer and closer until they stopped right outside the front door. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, barely breathing. I didn't dare look out the window. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving. Felt like they were waiting for something. The air inside the cabin felt too heavy, like I couldn't get enough of it. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. It was hard to tell. Then, finally, I heard the footsteps move away, heading back into the woods, slowly disappearing into the sound of the wind. At first light, I grabbed my bag and ran to the car. The snow was deep, but I didn't care. I managed to get the car moving and drove down the narrow road, my heart racing the whole time. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back near town. I never went back to my grandma's cabin after that. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just someone passing through the woods. But part of me knows it wasn't that simple. Someone or something was watching the cabin, and they weren't just curious. They were waiting for me to make a move, to step outside, to leave myself open. And the worst part? I have no idea if they'll still be waiting if I ever go back. But I'm not going to find out. I thought the weekend would be quiet. I rented a small cabin out in the woods to get away from all the noise and stress. The place was far from everything, which was exactly what I wanted. The only other cabin nearby was Jim's, an old man who lived just down the dirt road. He was around 75, and all I knew about him was that he used to be a sergeant. He mostly stayed to himself. I didn't plan on talking to him, and I didn't think he'd come to bother me either. That seemed fine. The first couple of days were just as I hoped. I relaxed, walked around, and enjoyed how quiet everything was. But there was something strange about Jim's place. Every time I glanced at his cabin, it looked the same. The curtains were always shut tight, and I never saw any lights on, even at night. I knew he was there, though. His old, beat-up truck was always parked outside, and sometimes I'd hear faint sounds, like shuffling on his porch. Things started feeling off by the third night. I was winding down, getting ready to sleep, when I heard a strange noise coming from Jim's cabin. It wasn't loud, but it didn't stop. It was a soft, steady thump, like someone was tapping on wood. First, I brushed it off. Could have been an animal or just the wind messing with something outside. But the noise kept going. It didn't stop for hours, just this slow, constant tapping. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The sound echoed in the quiet night, making my skin crawl. Around midnight, the noise finally stopped. Feeling relieved, I managed to fall asleep, thinking it was over. The next morning, I decided to walk by Jim's cabin. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt uneasy. His place looked as quiet as always, the windows shut, no sign of life. As I walked past, though, I noticed something strange. There were long scratches on the side of his cabin, like something had scraped against the wood. They were fresh, too. I couldn't tell what made them, but it wasn't something small. That night, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, and I swear it was closer. The sound wasn't just coming from Jim's place anymore. I could feel it, like it was vibrating through the walls of my own cabin. It wasn't just random knocks either. There was a slow rhythm to it, like someone was knocking with a purpose. I sat up in bed, listening. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going over to Jim's cabin, not in the middle of the night. But the noise was driving me crazy. It felt like it was getting under my skin, and no matter what, I couldn't shake this growing sense of fear. And then, just like before, the tapping stopped. I felt a bit of relief, but then I heard something worse. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps on the gravel outside. And they weren't coming from Jim's place. They were right outside my cabin. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the steps slowly circled around my cabin. They were heavy, like someone in boots walking with a purpose. I tried to listen to figure out where they were coming from, but whoever was out there moved too carefully. They knew exactly what they were doing. After what felt like hours, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but there was only silence. Somehow, I eventually fell asleep, though it wasn't restful. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows. I had had enough. I packed my things, ready to leave and never come back. But as I stepped outside, something stopped me cold. There were large footprints in the gravel outside my cabin. They were deep, like someone heavy had been pacing around all night. And they didn't lead away from my cabin. They led toward it from Jim's place. I glanced over at his cabin. His truck was gone. I got in my car and left as quickly as I could. Later, I found out that Jim hadn't been seen for weeks. Nobody knew where he went or why he left so suddenly. Some said he just moved on, but others seemed unsure. There was no real explanation for it. But the thing is, sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear that soft, steady tapping. It's like it's right outside my window again, tapping slow and sure, just waiting. And now I can't stop thinking whatever was in those woods wasn't just interested in Jim. Found me too. And one day it's gonna come back. I was deep in the woods of northern Canada when I came across an old cabin. It looked empty, covered in green moss, and surrounded by thick trees. The air felt cold, and the quiet made everything seem strange. I had been walking for hours, trying to get away from life's problems, and thought this might be a good spot to rest for a while. The door creaked open when I pushed it. Inside, it was full of dust, with cobwebs in the corners. There was an old fireplace with a bunch of logs next to it. The smell of wet wood filled the air, and the floor creaked under my feet. It seemed like no one had been here in a long time. I wasn't sure if the place was safe, but I was too tired to worry. I sat by the fireplace but decided not to start a fire. I didn't want to attract attention in case someone was nearby, though I didn't think anyone would be out this far. The sun was going down, and long shadows stretched through the cracks in the walls. I kept hearing noises outside, like branches breaking, but I tried to ignore them. The forest was full of animals, probably just them moving around. After a while, I heard something different, a steady sound, like slow footsteps. They were coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, listening, trying to tell myself it was just the old cabin shifting in the cold. But the noise was too steady, too clear. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I moved toward the small window on the side of the cabin, trying to see through the dirty glass. Nothing, but the footsteps were getting louder, closer. They sounded like they were moving around the cabin. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I wasn't alone. I grabbed a thick piece of wood from the pile and held it tight in my hands. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear anything, but everything went completely silent. It was that kind of silence that feels wrong, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, nothing dangerous. But then, from behind the cabin, I heard a slow scraping noise, like metal being dragged across wood. The sound made my skin crawl. It was coming from right outside the back wall of the cabin. I stepped away from the window, gripping the wood tighter. There was no way out except the front door, and I had no idea what was out there. My breathing was loud in the quiet, and the cabin suddenly felt much smaller, like it was closing in on me. Then came a loud bang from the back of the cabin. Something hit the wall hard, making the whole place shake. My heart jumped, and I ran toward the door. Before I could reach it, another bang echoed through the cabin, this time closer, like whatever was out there was trying to get in. I yanked the door open and bolted into the woods, not daring to look back. My legs burned as I ran through the trees, branches cutting at my arms and face. I didn't stop running until I could no longer hear the cabin or the bangs, until the forest became dead silent again. I never went back to that cabin. For weeks after, I tried to tell myself it was just an animal or maybe the wind. But deep down, I know something else was out there that day. Something I couldn't see but could hear. Something that didn't belong. Now, every time I'm alone in the woods, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. The worst part is, I've started hearing those same footsteps at night, even when I'm back home. They circle my house sometimes, just like they circled that cabin. And each time, they sound like they're getting closer. I always looked forward to weekends with my wife at our cabin in the woods. It was a break from the craziness of my job as a gym trainer. This time, we planned to stay for 2 nights, hoping to relax and enjoy the outdoors together. When we got there, the air was fresh, and the trees stood tall like old protectors. I started unpacking while my wife, Sarah, prepared a simple lunch. After we ate, I suggested we hike to a nearby lake I had found on a previous trip. Sarah was eager and we set off, following a narrow path through thick trees. The hike felt refreshing. We inhaled the earthy smell of pine and heard the gentle rustle of leaves above us. As we walked, I thought about how lucky we were to have this quiet escape. The path eventually brought us to the lake, its surface sparkling in the afternoon sun. We sat on a rock, dipping our feet in the cool water, completely relaxed. As the sun began to set, we made our way back. The light started to dim, and the woods changed. Shadows crept in around us. I noticed the trail looked different now. The trees felt closer, and the path seemed narrower. I shook it off as just my imagination, thinking maybe I didn't remember it clearly. Then I felt it, a presence behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. I quickened my pace, urging Sarah to keep up. I didn't want to scare her, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We walked faster, our footsteps echoing in the deepening darkness. We reached a fork in the path, and I hesitated. One way felt familiar, while the other led deeper into the woods. My gut told me to take the well-known path, but something drew me to the other one. Ignoring my instinct, I chose the unknown. The further we went, the quieter it became. The cheerful sounds of birds faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. I sensed Sarah's fear. She tightened her grip on my arm. I tried to reassure her, but I felt just as uneasy. After a few minutes, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, but again, nothing was there. My unease turned to fear. Felt like the woods were alive, watching us. I urged Sarah to keep moving, our pace quickening with every step. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was an old fire pit, choked with weeds. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just an empty space. It felt wrong, like a place holding secrets. Suddenly, I heard a noise from behind us, a rustling in the bushes. My heart raced as I turned, but I saw only shadows. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we sprinted away from the clearing, desperate to find our way back. I focused on the path ahead, praying I would remember the way. We ran, adrenaline pumping, until the trees started to thin, and we found ourselves back on the main trail. Breathing heavily, I led us to the cabin. Once inside, we locked the door and flipped on every light. I tried to shake off the fear, convincing myself it was just our imagination. but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. That night, we struggled to sleep. Every little sound made us jump. I replayed everything in my mind, wondering if we had crossed into someone's territory. As dawn broke, the tension eased, but the dread of the night before lingered in the back of my mind. After breakfast, I suggested we head home early. I wanted to get away from the woods as soon as possible. We packed quickly, still rattled, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked peaceful, but I felt a knot in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't want us there. As we drove along the winding road, I promised myself we'd return one day. But deep down, I wondered if the woods held a darker secret meant to stay hidden, a place not meant for everyone. I felt a chill thinking about it. What if the woods were protecting something? A memory from long ago, or a creature lurking just out of sight? That thought haunted me. Nature is not just beautiful. It can be frightening too, hiding secrets we aren't meant to uncover. And as I drove away, I realized we might not have been alone out there. What if we weren't the only ones who had entered those woods, and whatever else had been there was still watching, waiting for the next chance to emerge? The sun was setting behind the hills as my wife, her brother, and I arrived at the old farm cabin. I had been here a few times before, but each time it always gave me a creepy feeling. The cabin stood all by itself, surrounded by trees that seemed to be hiding something. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, convincing myself it was just the quiet of the place. We unloaded the car and settled in. The smell of wood and dirt filled the cabin, and as night fell, we lit a fire in the stone fireplace. Shadows flickered on the walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere. We ate dinner, sharing stories and laughter, but the feeling of unease never really went away. As it got darker, my wife suggested we go for a walk outside. I didn't want to, but I agreed anyway. We stepped out onto the porch, and the cool air wrapped around us like a blanket. I could hear leaves rustling in the distance and the occasional call of an owl. My brother-in-law thought we should check out the barn, which was just a short walk from the cabin. I hesitated but felt a pull of curiosity, so I followed. The barn was old and creaked beneath our feet as we entered. Moonlight streamed through the gaps in the wood, making long shadows dance across the floor. I felt a chill run down my back as I looked around. The barn was empty, but something didn't feel right. My gut told me we should leave, but we moved deeper inside. As we got to the back of the barn, I spotted something odd. A pile of old tools tossed together. My brother-in-law reached out to touch them, and just then, I heard a noise outside, like a soft whisper. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. My heart started to race. The feeling of being watched crept over me again. I said we should head back, but my brother-in-law wanted to check the tools more closely. I stood by the door, glancing outside again. The trees were still, but something felt off at the edge of the woods. A few minutes later, my brother-in-law stepped back, looking worried. He had found an old, rusted saw with dried blood on it. We exchanged nervous glances, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. Something was very wrong. We decided it was time to leave the barn. When we stepped outside, the atmosphere felt different. The air crackled with a strange energy, and I felt a rush to get back to the cabin. I looked over my shoulder and thought I saw a figure watching us from the trees, but it was gone before I could focus. Once we were back inside, we locked the door, our nerves on edge. We sat in silence, listening to the wind whispering outside. The shadows in the cabin felt alive, and my mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the dark corners. Finally, my wife suggested we go to bed. I agreed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the dark, hearing every creak of the cabin. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the early morning hours, a loud crash jolted me awake. I sat up, my heart racing. I looked at my wife, who was still asleep, and my brother-in-law, who was already awake, staring out the window with wide eyes. He turned to me, pale as a ghost, and pointed. I rushed to the window, and what I saw made my stomach drop. A large, shadowy figure stood near the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too big to be an animal. We all froze, breathless with fear, unable to take our eyes off it. Just then, the figure moved, disappearing into the woods. The silence that followed felt like a heavy blanket. We hurried to get dressed, and I suggested we leave right away. We packed our things as fast as we could, the air thick with anxiety. As we drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin looked even more menacing in the early morning light, surrounded by dark trees that seemed to lean in closer. A chill ran down my spine, knowing that something had been watching us, something that wanted us gone. We promised each other we would never return to that place again. The experience left us shaken, but it also brought us closer together in a strange way. I realized the woods could hold more than just trees and shadows. They could hide dark secrets that were better left untouched. As we drove further away, the feeling of being watched began to fade, but the memory of that night clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the thought that we might not have been alone in those woods. What if that figure was still out there, waiting for someone else to step into its territory? The woods, with their secrets and darkness, felt alive, and I knew we had escaped something we couldn't understand. But what if it was just the beginning? The thought lingered, making my heart race. We had rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the noise of the city. My husband, Jake, had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. That first evening, we settled in, enjoyed a hot meal, and lit a fire in the stone fireplace. As the sun went down and darkness surrounded the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling wood and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The next morning, I woke up early. Light poured through the window, making soft shadows dance around the room. Jake was still asleep, so I decided to take a walk around the property. The air was fresh, and I could hear birds singing in the trees. I wandered down a narrow trail behind the cabin, enjoying the calm. After a while, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud along the path, too big to be from any animal. My heart began to race as I realized they led deeper into the woods. I turned back, a chill creeping up my spine, but the peaceful beauty of the surroundings made me brush off my fear. Maybe someone else was hiking nearby, I thought. That evening, we sat outside, roasting marshmallows and gazing at the stars. But as darkness fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to enjoy the moment, but every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. Jake noticed I was uneasy and suggested we go inside. As we settled in for the night, I tried to push my worries aside. I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howl through the trees. I was about to drift off when I heard something outside, a low sound, almost like a growl. I nudged Jake awake, but he only mumbled and rolled over. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek out the window. The moonlight lit up the yard, casting strange shadows. Nothing seemed wrong, but a sense of dread washed over me. I lay back down, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. Around 3 a.m., I heard the sound again, this time closer and clearer. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the side of the cabin. I quietly got up and looked out the window once more. My breath caught in my throat. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in torn clothes, staring at the cabin. I froze, not wanting to make a sound. He looked wild and dirty, with messy hair and a grimy face. I stepped back from the window, panic flooding through me. I shook Jake awake again, more urgently this time. He sat up, groggy, but I quickly explained what I saw. He moved to the window and peered out, but there was nothing there. "There's no one there," he said, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I didn't want to take any chances. I grabbed my phone and called the local sheriff, explaining what had happened. They assured me someone would come to check on us soon. Jake moved to the door, peeking out into the dark. A few minutes later, we heard a knock. I jumped, and Jake opened the door cautiously. A deputy stood there, flashlight in hand. "Evening, folks. Got a call about a disturbance," he said, shining his light around the area. We told him about the figure I had seen, and he nodded, a look of concern on his face. "Stay inside while I take a look," he instructed, heading toward the trees. The moments felt like hours as we waited. I clutched Jake's arm, both of us tense. Finally, the deputy came back, shaking his head. "I didn't see anyone, but I'll stay nearby for a while, just in case," he said, giving us a reassuring smile. I felt a little relief wash over me, but the dread still lingered. The deputy parked in front of the cabin, keeping an eye on the woods. I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with fear. Hours passed, but nothing happened. As the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the cabin, I stepped outside, feeling the weight of the night lift a bit. But the memory of that man haunted me. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I was grateful we were safe. After packing our things, we left the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those woods. As we drove away, I glanced back, watching the cabin fade into the trees. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about the man in the shadows. He might still be out there, waiting for the next couple to come along, ready to pick up where he left off. I promised myself we would never return. The woods felt alive, filled with something far more dangerous than any ghost, and I couldn't help but feel that he was watching us leave, planning his next move. The excitement of my college trip to France buzzed in my mind as I stepped into the small cabin tucked away in the woods near the Loire Valley. It was meant to be a peaceful getaway, a break from exams and stress. I came with my friends, eager to relax before we got our results. We had heard stories about this place, but nothing prepared me for what would happen that night. The sun set early, and soon the cabin was filled with darkness. We lit a fire in the fireplace, its flickering light casting moving shadows on the walls. I felt a strange chill creep into the room, but I ignored it, thinking it was just the cold night air. As we settled in, laughter and chatter filled the space, drowning out any unease. Later, after some time playing games, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The moon hung low in the sky, lighting up the tall trees around us. The woods were silent, a sharp contrast to the lively cabin. I took a deep breath, enjoying the moment of peace. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I thought it was just a small animal, but then I noticed something strange. A pair of eyes staring at me from the dark. I froze, my heart racing. They were too high off the ground for a deer. I squinted, trying to see what it was. The eyes blinked, and I felt a strong urge to turn and run back to the cabin. But my curiosity held me there for a moment. Just as I turned my head, something moved quickly in the shadows. Panic shot through me, and I bolted back to the cabin, my feet pounding against the ground. When I burst through the door, I found my friends huddled together, their faces pale. They had noticed something strange too. One of them had seen a figure lurking just outside the tree line, a shadow that seemed to watch us before slipping away. We decided to stick together and stay awake, watching the dark forest through the windows and listening for any sign of the unknown presence. The hours dragged on, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the wind whispering through the trees. As fatigue began to weigh us down, we took turns keeping watch. I found myself staring into the dark, my heart racing every time a branch snapped outside. Just before dawn, I felt a strong urge to look outside again. I pulled open the cabin door and peered into the dim morning light. The woods looked different in the daylight, less scary, but the chill from the night still hung in the air. I stepped outside, feeling the cool ground under my feet. That's when I saw it. A strange, rough marking on a tree trunk near the edge of the woods, a circle with an X through it. My stomach dropped as I recognized it from an article I had read about a cult that once operated in the area, known for their secretive rituals. Feeling sick, I called my friends out to show them. As we examined the symbol, a sense of dread filled the air. We realized we weren't just in a pretty retreat. We were in a place with a dark past. That night was not a mere coincidence. Whatever had watched us in the dark was part of that history. We quickly gathered our things, wanting to leave the cabin that now felt less like a safe haven and more like a trap. As we drove away, the sun rose over the trees, casting a warm light over the forest. Relief washed over me as we left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, the unsettling sense that we had disturbed something that should have remained hidden. The college results came a week later. I had done well, but the experience at the cabin haunted me. I couldn't forget that chilling night. We'd gone to France for a break, only to uncover a darkness that felt like it would always follow us. Even as I tried to focus on my future, I kept seeing those eyes in the dark, lurking, waiting. It was a reminder that some places carry the weight of their past, and the shadows we ignore may have stories they want to share, stories that are better left untold. I was really excited to spend the weekend at my dad's friend's cabin in the woods. The cabin was a simple wooden building, surrounded by tall trees and a calm lake. We arrived just before sunset, and I helped my dad bring in our bags and supplies. The air smelled like pine trees, mixed with the scent of wood burning in the fireplace. Once we unpacked, my dad and his friend, Tom, sat outside on the porch, reminiscing about old times. I wandered around the cabin, taking in the sights. The woods were thick, and the sound of leaves rustling made everything feel alive. As I explored, I noticed a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. My curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to follow it for a little while. The path twisted and turned, and soon I could no longer hear my dad and Tom's voices. I walked for what felt like hours, my excitement turning into worry as I realized how far I had gone. The trees grew denser, and the air felt heavier. I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. That's when I saw something odd. A torn piece of cloth caught on a branch. It looked like it might belong to a jacket. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, and turned to head back. But as I walked, the silence around me deepened. The wind had stopped blowing, and the only sound was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I picked up my pace, but the path felt longer than before. It felt like someone was watching me, and every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. Finally, I came to a clearing and thought I could cut through it to get back to the cabin faster. I stepped into the open space and suddenly felt a chill run down my spine. In the center of the clearing was an old, rusty car, half hidden by weeds. Its windows were broken, and the paint was peeling off. My heart raced as I moved closer. It felt wrong, like the car was a reminder of something dark and scary. Just then, I noticed more torn fabric on the ground, mixed with leaves and dirt. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to leave. I turned to go, but then I heard it, a faint sound, like someone softly calling my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, feeling closer. I didn't want to look back, but I felt drawn to see what it was. Gathering all my courage, I turned around and saw a shadow at the edge of the trees. It was just a dark shape, but it looked like it was watching me. Panic filled me, and I sprinted back the way I came, dodging branches and roots as I ran. The whispers echoed behind me, growing louder, but I didn't stop until I burst through the cabin door. I slammed it shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a moment to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I could hear my dad and Tom laughing outside, the sound grounding me, but deep down, I knew I had stumbled onto something that shouldn't be there. As night fell, the air got colder. I tried to shake off my fear, but the whispers continued to haunt me. I could see shadows moving outside the windows, and every noise made my heart race. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to come in. After what felt like hours, my dad finally called for me, saying it was time to settle down for the night. I forced a smile, but my unease lingered. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had really come across out there. In the morning, I decided to tell my dad about the car and the whispers, but as I shared my story, I noticed Tom's face go pale. A strange look crossed his eyes as he turned to my dad. Turned out that years ago, someone had gone missing in those woods. The old car was connected to that case, and the whispers, they were likely the cries of a lost soul still looking for help. I felt a chill run down my spine, realizing I had been closer to something terrifying than I ever wanted to be. The rest of the trip was filled with tension. I never stepped into the woods again. As we packed to leave, I glanced back at the trees, feeling relief wash over me that I was finally getting away. But as we drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. That night, as I lay in bed back at home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the whispers and the shadow in the woods. I tried to convince myself that it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. I couldn't escape the sense of dread creeping over me, as if it followed me home. Days passed, but I felt a dark weight on my chest. I began to hear faint whispers in the dead of night, and shadows danced in the corners of my room. I could no longer tell if it was my imagination or something from that night in the woods. I started to dread falling asleep, fearing that if I did, I might wake up back in that clearing, staring at that car, with the whispers calling me closer, pulling me into the darkness forever.